At the beginning of 1945, with Hitler's Third Reich on the brink of collapse, the Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine, while the Red Army was relentlessly advancing toward the German border. The year 1944 had been disastrous for the Germans on the Eastern Front, culminating in the annihilation of Army Group Center and the relentless pursuit of the Red Army to the gates of Warsaw. Faced with imminent defeat, Hitler made a monumental decision to send his last armored reserves to relieve the city's defenders and secure Hungary's oil fields. Meanwhile, in the Kremlin, Stalin summoned his most aggressive generals and created a subtle competition among them, highlighting the routes to Berlin and challenging them to be the first to capture the city. By mid-April 1945, the outcome of the war in Europe was indisputable. The Allied forces were advancing on multiple fronts, solidifying the inevitability of the result. Berlin, a metropolis reduced from 4.3 million to 3 million inhabitants since the beginning of the war, was witnessing the collapse of the Nazi regime, with only the most fervent supporters maintaining any hope until the very end. Hitler blamed the German people, considering them cowards for not having fought more firmly. Prepare yourself, for today you will learn every minute detail of this battle, and you will see why this combat is extremely well known throughout the world. As the final days of Nazi Germany approached, Hitler, still reluctant to surrender, issued orders impossible for the Germans to carry out given the circumstances. While meeting in his secret bunker beneath Berlin, the main members of his staff offered personnel to defend the Oder River. Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring offered 100,000 men from the Luftwaffe. Heinrich Himmler offered 25,000 SS soldiers, and Admiral Dönitz offered 12,000 sailors. However, the new commander of Army Group Vistula, Commander Gotthard Heinrici, who had replaced Himmler, disagreed with the addition of such personnel and believed that the inexperienced soldiers would be useless and, in the end, massacred. Göring countered, claiming that his Luftwaffe men were Übermenschen, or superhumans. Hitler ended the discussion by telling Gotthard that reinforcements would arrive in time. Heinrici disagreed with Hitler's statement, but kept his opinion to himself. By Christmas 1944, morale among Berliners was at a critical point, with only the most fervent and fanatical supporters of the Nazi regime maintaining any hope. British and American air raids continued to intensify, forcing many residents to spend more time in shelters than outside. But it was not the British or the Americans they truly feared. It was the persistent threat from the East, the successor state of the nation that had once nearly humiliated Frederick the Great and whose people had suffered greatly, the USSR. Thanks to the Reich's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, Berliners knew that the Soviets were coming. By April 1945, the Allies were closing in, and the old Berlin was gone. Now it lay in ruins. This was the capital of the Reich, the center of Nazi power, and Berlin was a ghost city disintegrating. Electrical cables hung everywhere, flooding, buildings ablaze, civilians living like rats in burrows. At this point, it was clear that the victory would be military for the Allies and Soviets alike, but it was also a grim prelude to what was to come. In 1944, morale had improved after the initial phases of the Ardennes counteroffensive, also known as the Battle of the Bulge, which delayed the Allied advance by 5 to 6 weeks. However, more perceptive members of the German High Command were worried, knowing that the Reich was in no position to adequately defend its eastern border. Generals like Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff, were fully aware of the imminent advance of the Red Army, which outnumbered and outgunned its German counterpart. It was argued that once the Ardennes offensive bore no fruit, much of its forces should be diverted eastward. However, Hitler remained convinced, believing that the odds could not be so unfavorable for the superior Germans. He was validated by Heinrich Himmler, his right-hand man, who considered the idea of a Soviet offensive little more than a bluff. The Soviet forces had gone on the offensive after the spectacular defeat of Army Group Center during the gigantic Operation Bagration in 1944. from which the Wehrmacht never recovered. Not only that, but captured Germans were even forced to march through Moscow that same year. In the winter of 1944, they pushed the German front lines back through Poland, suffering heavy casualties on both sides. That winter would prove to be bloody, as fighting drew closer to Germany itself. Stalin wanted revenge for Hitler's betrayal of the non-aggression pact. Using his marshals Zhukov and Konev, he was determined to reach Berlin and the Reichstag before Eisenhower. Since the Allies had landed in Normandy, the British and American armies had moved swiftly and decisively to seize western French cities and liberate Paris. By September 1944, Allied forces had reached the German border, but the subsequent failure of Operation Market Garden prevented a decisive penetration into the heart of Germany before year's end. In December, as we've seen, Hitler launched an unsuccessful offensive known as the Battle of the Bulge. 5 years after Hitler had begun the bloodiest conflict in history, the war returned to Germany. As the Anglo-Americans advanced from the west and massive Soviet armies descended from the east, the once grand Nazi empire was shrinking by the day. By 1945, Nazi Germany as a military power was practically defeated. Germany was now reduced to a relatively narrow corridor, devoid of men, incapable of resupplying itself, plunged into chaos. The Germans themselves knew that the war would not last much longer. With Hitler practically defeated, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin invited the Allied leaders, US President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, to Crimea for his final wartime conference to celebrate the imminent victory. Yalta was chosen because it was February, cold as a Russian winter. And this was one of the warmest places that could be found in the Soviet Union. The palace itself, with over 100 rooms, looked like a giant white wedding cake facing the Black Sea. If you entered one of those rooms filled with sparkling crystal, caviar, and Soviet champagne, it seemed quite delightful. Stalin was charming, a gracious host, offering excellent Crimean wines, aged 40 to 50 years, so that Churchill could drink. An interesting curiosity was that French leader General Charles de Gaulle was not invited to the Yalta or Potsdam conferences, a diplomatic omission that became the cause of deep and lasting resentment. De Gaulle attributed his exclusion from Yalta to the long-standing personal antipathy Roosevelt held toward him, but the Soviets also opposed his inclusion as a full participant. However, the absence of French representation at Yalta also meant that extending an invitation to de Gaulle to attend the Potsdam Conference would have been highly problematic, since he would have felt compelled to insist that all issues agreed upon at Yalta in his absence be reopened. The atmosphere at Yalta soon gave way to tension when the Western Allies revealed to Stalin that their troops had hit a barrier in the West. After advancing from Normandy through Belgium, France, the Netherlands, and up to the German border, for much of those winter months, they had not moved very far. February 1945 was the month with the second highest number of casualties in the war for Churchill and Roosevelt. So yes, the war was won, but still thousands of American and British soldiers were dying. With little appetite on the Western side to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of men if the war were to end quickly, the main burden on the ground would fall to the weary Joseph Stalin and his exhausted armies. Stalin received this information with skepticism. He believed they wanted to lure the Red Army into being further decimated by the Germans in order to spare the British and Americans from losing more men in the West. Each of the three leaders had his own agenda for post-war Germany and liberated Europe. Roosevelt wanted Soviet support in the Pacific War against Japan, specifically for the planned attack on Japan, Operation August Storm, as well as Soviet participation in the United Nations. Churchill pressed for free elections and democratic governments in Central and Eastern Europe, specifically in Poland. Stalin demanded a Soviet political sphere of influence in Eastern and Central Europe as an essential aspect of the Soviets' national security strategy, and his position at the conference was so strong that he felt he could dictate terms. According to U.S. delegation member and future Secretary of State James F. Burns, it was not a question of what we would allow the Russians to do, but of what we could get the Russians to do. Stalin reluctantly agreed that his troops would bear the brunt of the fight to take Berlin, but in return, he wanted some guarantees from the Allies regarding the post-war world. He wanted to ensure that the Soviet sphere of influence would be protected and controlled as much as possible, providing a buffer zone and potential for future expansion. In addition to a communist bloc in Europe, Stalin demanded that, after the war, Germany be divided among them. The goal was to ensure that Germany could never again rise as a military power and threaten Europe or the world. They agreed on the demarcation boundaries. They agreed that, at this point, the British, Americans, and Soviets would each have zones both in Germany and in Berlin. Berlin represented a fascinating compromise at Yalta. According to the established zones, Berlin was entirely within the Soviet zone. However, they made a special exception for Berlin, likely to demonstrate its significance. The Americans and British received slices of Berlin as zones within the Soviet zone. As the war neared its end, when German military power was collapsing, Allied forces surrounded the Nazi concentration camps. The Soviets arrived from the east, and the British, French, and Americans from the west. Frantically, the Germans began removing prisoners from camps near the front lines and sending them to forced labor camps within Germany itself. At first, prisoners were transported by train, but later they were forced to walk long distances on foot in what became known as the Death Marches. They were forced to march great distances, exposed to extreme cold without coats, with little or no food, water, or rest. Those who could not keep up were shot dead. The largest death marches occurred in the winter of 1944 to 1945, when the Soviet army began liberating Poland. 9 days before the Soviets reached Auschwitz, the Germans forced tens of thousands of prisoners to march from those camps toward Wodzislaw, a city 56 kilometers away, from where they were transported to other camps in freight trains. On average, 1 in every 4 prisoners died along the way. Countless times, the Nazis executed large numbers of prisoners before, during, and after the marches. In one such case, 7,000 Jewish prisoners, among them 6,000 women, were removed from camps in the Danzig region, which bordered the Baltic Sea to the north. During that 10-day march, 700 human beings did not survive the ordeal and either died or were coldly executed by the German Nazis. The survivors who managed to reach the Baltic coast were forced into the water, where they were mercilessly shot to death. With the post-war map defined, Joseph Stalin began planning the final great assault of the war. It was a chance for him to finally secure his legacy as a great leader. Stalin had always wanted to be a military commander. He began as the son of a cobbler in Georgia, studied for the priesthood, converted to Marxism, and became a fanatical Marxist. From the beginning of the revolution that transformed Russia from a czarist empire into a communist state, Stalin's ambitions only grew. He saw himself, above all, as a historical figure, a Russian leader, a successor to Peter the Great and Alexander I, who had conquered Paris. When Lenin fell ill and died in 1924, Stalin gradually assumed leadership of the country. During his rule, socialism in one country became a central principle of the party's doctrine, and his predecessor's new economic policy was replaced by a centralized economy. Under the 5-year plan system, the country underwent collectivization and rapid industrialization, but suffered significant disruptions in food production that contributed to the famine between 1932 and 1933. To eradicate those considered enemies of the working class, Stalin instituted the Great Purge, during which more than 1 million people were imprisoned and at least 700,000 executed between 1934 and 1939. But for the supreme Russian leader, capturing Berlin was more than simply a military achievement. It was about avenging Hitler's murderous enemies. This 4-year war waged against the Soviet people. Adolf Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in pursuit of totalitarian conquest. He wanted to exterminate the people who lived there, or turn them into a kind of slave to serve the German master race. The war he unleashed upon the Soviet Union was genocidal. They waged this ideological war that involved burning villages, lining people up and shooting them, treating vast numbers of prisoners of war as slaves, and letting them die of starvation. Tens of millions of people were killed. The Soviet soldiers, having witnessed the atrocities committed in their homeland, felt a burning desire to bring the fight directly to the Germans. Germany, in turn, had become a battlefield after 3 years of intense bombing. Nearly all of its major cities had been reduced to rubble, including Berlin, which was now preparing for a final showdown. Hitler referred to Berlin as a fortress city, implying that it must be defended to the last man. The prevailing mentality was that every soldier must fight to the death to protect the city. This was Hitler's ethos, instilling an atmosphere of fear and dread in Berlin. He insisted that every meter of the city had to be defended without yielding or surrendering. The order was to keep fighting, no matter the cost. The remaining defenders of Germany now had an arduous task ahead. In January 1945, the Soviets took advantage of the momentum from Operation Bagration to launch the Vistula-Oder offensive, a massive push through Poland that saw Germany lose its first major conquest of the war. With the renowned Field Marshal Georgy Zhukov leading the Soviets, they annihilated 45 divisions, claiming to have killed or captured 100,000 men. The offensive was halted at the Oder River, on the border of the German homeland. The Minister of Propaganda recorded a sense of absolute dread sweeping through the Reich's capital, with Berlin citizens fearing that the Soviets now had a clear path to the city. The fear of the Russians grew in light of the difficulties faced by the Red Army as it tried to overcome fierce resistance. Stalin decided to send the infamous Marshal Georgy Zhukov to lead the campaign. Zhukov was undoubtedly ruthless and coarse, lacking the refinement typical of high-ranking officers, as he himself had no formal military education. Despite this, his skill and determination were undeniable. When he received an order, Zhukov devoted himself entirely to carrying it out. He led the major decisive battles of World War II and was an indispensable ally, the only general truly trusted by Stalin. As a battle-hardened veteran, Zhukov understood that an attack on Berlin would require the utmost effort and resources, especially in terms of artillery. The eyes of the world were now fixed on Berlin, as Stalin's armies prepared for their final act of vengeance that would eradicate Nazi Germany once and for all. Although the Allies had promised to leave Berlin to the Red Army, the ever-paranoid Stalin pressed for haste in capturing the city. The final plan consisted of a triple-axis attack toward Berlin to encircle and capture the city in 12 to 15 days, followed by a link-up with the Allies on the Elbe River. Zhukov's first Belarusian front would form the center of the advance, while Ivan Konev's first Ukrainian front to the south would attack across the Nesa River toward Potsdam and Dresden. Finally, Konstantin Rokossovsky's second Belarusian front would tie down German forces to the north in the Stettin-Schwedt sector, preventing them from reinforcing Berlin. Accustomed to fighting in open terrain, few in the Red Army had significant experience with large-scale urban warfare. It fell to General Vasily Chuikov of the 8th Guards Army, a veteran of the Battle of Stalingrad, to distribute pamphlets on urban warfare while special combined arms task forces were organized. The Red Army engineers worked day and night to construct hundreds of bridges and thousands of wooden assault boats to cross the Oder and Neisse rivers. To achieve this, Soviet planners had to find a way to move 29 armies across hundreds of kilometers, forming shock groups capable of breaking through the German line in areas only 2.5 to 10 kilometers wide. 2.5 million men, 7,000 aircraft, 40,000 guns, 7,000 tanks. But assembling such a massive force was no easy task. The farther the Red Army moved away from Soviet territory, the farther all these resources had to travel. Zhukov was anxious at this point, but they were running low on supplies. Aiming to make the invaders bleed for every inch of German soil, the Wehrmacht constructed a series of heavily fortified defensive lines blocking the way to Berlin. Commanding these positions were the remnants of Army Group Vistula and the 4th Panzer Army, along with the Berlin garrison. Together, these forces amounted to 750,000 German soldiers, supported by 1,519 tanks and assault guns, 9,303 artillery pieces and mortars, and 2,200 aircraft. However, these numbers looked far more impressive on paper than in reality, as virtually all formations were below full strength. Although many units were led by battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, their ranks were often filled with wounded, unfit, and inexperienced soldiers, including young members of the Hitler Youth. In addition, around 60,000 defenders came from the Volkssturm militia battalions, undertrained and poorly armed. The infantry could not rely much on their armored and air assets, since the Germans lacked fuel reserves to keep their considerable number of combat vehicles operational for an extended period. Morale was also low, with most suffering from malnutrition and poor hygiene. Except for the most fanatical Nazis, few now believed in the promise of a final victory. They are only about 60 kilometers from Berlin, but they have no airspeed, no energy. It requires patience. Yet, while he patiently waits for his troops to be resupplied, Stalin learns that his friends in the West are moving again. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill is excited about the possibility of the British Army reaching Berlin, ahead of the Soviets, after all. You have to remember that Winston Churchill is a soldier who has seen combat many times in his life. He fought in India, in Sudan, in the Boer War, and went to the trenches in the First World War. Churchill sees everything in grand historical terms. If you read his accounts of the Second World War, for example, there are all those references from the Romans to the Etruscans, and obviously, for him, taking Berlin is one of those moments, a way to show the Western troops, who fought in every theater, that this moment could be theirs. The goal is to demonstrate that the British still have influence in the unfolding of events. It is highly symbolic that they are advancing toward Western Germany. However, they face a major challenge: the Rhine River. This vast and ancient river represents a formidable obstacle. The bridges over the Rhine were destroyed by the Germans, leaving the Allies dependent on amphibious vehicle patrols, incapable of transporting a full army. However, when the Americans capture the last intact bridge at Remagen, near Bonn, the German forces fall into disarray. Suddenly, the Anglo-Americans resume their rapid advance toward Berlin. The news of the Allies' historic crossing of the Rhine reaches Stalin, who perceives a tactical opportunity. With his own armies stalled, he adopts a new approach. He sends a message to the Allies declaring that, in his view, Berlin has lost its strategic value. He states that they are not interested in the city as a priority target. Stalin, assertively, communicates that they will not go to Berlin and encourages the Allies to move forward. The telegram is stamped April 1st. Stalin summons Zhukov back to the Kremlin to share news, surprising him by also inviting General Ivan Konev to the meeting. Stalin, a master manipulator, demonstrates his cunning by instilling fear in his generals. The rivalry between Zhukov and Konev is old. Konev, with his shaved head and aggressive demeanor, is the opposite of Zhukov, but both are respected combat generals. Stalin, examining the map, asks who will capture Berlin. He tries to minimize the city's importance, but his concern is evident. He creates a race for Berlin, fearing that the Western Allies might get there first. Stalin knew that the agreements made at Yalta about the future of Eastern Europe held little value. While he tries to persuade the Allies that Berlin is not important to Russia, he secretly mobilizes millions of soldiers to seize it. A race for Berlin, from a practical and military point of view, is dangerous and reckless. increasing the risk of friendly casualties. In purely strategic terms, it is a terrible idea. However, emotionally, politically, and in terms of motivation, it is useful, at least in Stalin's mind. There is an additional reason he wants to reach Berlin first, one that even his generals do not know. Recently uncovered information from Russian archives reveals that in February, the Germans detonated a bomb in Thuringia, similar to an atomic bomb, in secret. This was highly classified information known only to a few people. Stalin's spies also discovered that Hitler's atomic laboratory was in Berlin. Aware of the many secrets in Berlin, including the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, where the Germans were conducting nuclear experiments, Stalin was determined to obtain the uranium and scientific data to boost the Soviet nuclear effort. The race for Berlin thus becomes not only a matter of military strategy, but also of secret nuclear interests. However, Churchill begins to realize that they are being manipulated. He recognizes the centrality of Europe on the global chessboard and is fully aware of the threat posed by communism. He fears that, if they do not act cautiously, the communists of the Soviet Union will advance into the West. Churchill was the first to perceive the threat that Hitler represented to world peace, and understood long before others the danger of Bolshevism. Churchill saw clearly that a new battle was emerging, a struggle for control of Eastern Europe, and that the Western Allies had a moral responsibility to protect that region from Stalin. If Churchill can keep the Anglo-Americans moving, there is still a chance to take Berlin and save Germany and Eastern Europe from communism. It seems that this opportunity may be within their grasp now. As they cross the Rhine, they encounter severely weakened German forces. Hitler's ranks are so decimated that he must resort to forming the Volkssturm, composed of civilians, the young, and the elderly, many without uniforms. Many members fought to the death out of fear of being captured by the Soviets, resisting to the end, in accordance with their alliance. Without training or cohesion, the German defense collapses. Volkssturm units fought desperate battles against Allied forces in Berlin, and, on several occasions, their members participated in atrocities alongside German civilians and the Hitler Youth, supervised by members of the Schutzstaffel. However, Churchill faces a problem. The British are short on men, while the Americans hold absolute control of the Western Alliance. Less than a month before Germany's surrender in the war in Europe, on April 12, 1945, the American president dies. But Churchill's prospects of persuading the Americans to advance on Berlin suffer a setback with the sudden death of his closest ally. Now, the decision to capture the German capital falls upon the sober and pragmatic supreme commander of the Allied forces, Dwight Eisenhower. The Soviet advance and eventual capture of the German capital went unchallenged by the Western Allies. In an effort to avoid a diplomatic problem, U.S. Army General Dwight Eisenhower attempted to direct his forces toward southern Germany to cut off and annihilate the Wehrmacht there and prevent the possibility of the German government attempting to resist in a national stronghold in the Alps. Eisenhower was willing to advance toward Berlin, provided it could be done with relative ease and few casualties. However, looming over him was the concern about the imminent battle in Japan, which everyone feared would be the mother of all battles. The planned invasion of the southern Japanese islands promised to be bloody and terrible, given the expected resistance of the Japanese. Rushing toward Berlin unnecessarily would only weaken the forces destined to face Japan. General Eisenhower's armies were encountering resistance that ranged from almost non-existent to fanatical as they advanced toward Berlin, which was 200 kilometers from their positions at the beginning of April 1945. Winston Churchill urged Eisenhower to continue the advance toward Berlin through the 21st Army Group, under the command of Field Marshal Montgomery, with the intention of capturing the city. Even General George S. Patton agreed with Churchill that he should order the attack on the city, as Montgomery's troops could reach Berlin in 3 days. However, General Omar Bradley warned that capturing a city located in a region already assigned to the Soviets at the Yalta Conference could cost 100,000 casualties. On April 15th, Eisenhower ordered all armies to stop when they reached the Elbe and Mulde rivers, thus immobilizing the spearheads while the war continued for another 3 weeks. Stalin decided to intensify his plan, fearing that the Allies might overtake them. With his armies advancing toward Berlin, Stalin was direct with his generals. They had only 2 weeks to reach the Reichstag, the iconic parliamentary building in the heart of the city. For the Soviets, the Reichstag was a symbol of the Third Reich. Its capture would have tremendous significance. Joseph Stalin insisted that the building be taken in time for International Workers' Day, which was on May 1st. Stalin ordered that the Allies be given no chance to get there first. He wanted the Soviet flag flying over the Reichstag immediately. Thus, the race was officially on. With Zhukov advancing from the east and Konev moving from the south, millions of Soviet soldiers were in full march toward Berlin. We're talking about an immense army, not a small force. They were closing in on one of the great capitals of the world. Berlin was a colossal city in its own right. In addition to being filled with military personnel awaiting the Soviets, it also housed a trapped and terrified civilian population waiting for the imminent assault. The Berliners were paralyzed with fear about what was to come. As news of the Russians' imminent arrival spread, some tried to escape while there was still time. Questions arose about whether to abandon Berlin before the next great attack was unleashed, perhaps resulting in tragedy. Most people just wanted to survive, especially families and mothers, who were determined to face this impending catastrophe. People did what they could to protect themselves. Defenses and fortifications were erected in a desperate effort to defend the capital. Trenches were dug in the parks, anti-tank ditches were excavated, and mines were planted. While Berliners mobilized to protect their homes, what was left of the German army dug trenches on the edges of the city. The first line of defense was in an area known as the Seelow Heights, considered by the Germans as the Gates of Berlin. The Seelow Heights were enormous cliffs, and the top formed a kind of platform, giving the Germans a perfect view of the valley below. They were entrenched and had removed as much equipment as possible. Heading straight into this mile of steep, heavily defended ground was Marshal Zhukov's army. If he wanted to meet Stalin's deadline, he knew he would have to attack with everything he had. So he decided to carry out the largest artillery bombardment ever seen on the planet. After this colossal wave of artillery, hundreds of men began shouting toward Berlin as tank engines roared and elite troops advanced toward the heights. Many German defenders, unfortunately caught in the previous attack, vanished in the blink of an eye, while stunned and terrified survivors retreated toward the second defensive line. However, the impressive bombardment concealed serious problems in Zhukov's plan. The destruction caused by the artillery had significantly worsened the condition of the terrain his troops now had to cross. Searchlights meant to blind the enemy reflected off the smoke-filled air, obscuring the advancing infantry's vision. In the resulting chaos, units lost contact with each other, and Soviet artillery and aircraft began attacking friendly formations. Furthermore, German intelligence had prior knowledge of the impending attack, which meant many frontline troops had already been evacuated to the rear. What followed was nothing short of a massacre. Soldiers were cut down as they advanced through flooded plains and German minefields. In other sectors, the attackers were repelled as they tried to cross the Oder River. Sensing disaster, Zhukov ordered his 2 tank armies to attack immediately. However, much of the infantry, artillery, and supply vehicles were still trying to reach the front, causing an endless traffic jam. Even when the leading tanks finally approached the heights, they were ambushed by hidden positions of 88mm guns, Tiger I tanks, and infantry armed with anti-tank rocket launchers. Disheartened, Zhukov's men made little progress by the end of the first day, taking another 3 days and countless deaths before his armies finally broke through the last defensive line. As a result of all this, Zhukov found himself at a standstill on the first day. and his plan was compromised when Moscow received word that the attack on the Silo Heights had failed. Zhukov took a call, and Stalin said to him, "So you underestimated the German defenses. I wonder who will reach Berlin now." At the same time, Stalin called Marshal Konev, Zhukov's rival, and said, "So did you hear the news? Zhukov isn't doing too well. He's kind of stalled. He's calling to encourage you, to provoke you, to mock you, setting one person against the other. Well, I bet you can get there first. I mean, what will happen if Zhukov gets there before you? You'll feel rather foolish, won't you?" Encouraged by the news that Zhukov was stuck, Konev made a thrust through a wooded area and pushed ahead. That's when Stalin said, "All right, Zhukov, what the hell is going on? Are you going to reach Berlin or not? Why aren't you moving?" Unfortunately for Zhukov's forces, his only way to beat Konev to Berlin now is to break through the German lines by brute force. The provocation works, because Zhukov then orders an assault on the Silo Heights against all the rules of tank warfare, and he loses 30,000 men. But he succeeds. Zhukov's relentless tactics put him side by side with Konev as their armies reach the outskirts of the city. Stalin's prize is almost in his hands. And now, at the final obstacle, he receives word that the Western Allies have reached the Elbe River, west of Berlin, and have decided not to advance any further. The Allied commander in the West, Dwight Eisenhower, had built his career on calm and measured decisions. Therefore, he decides not to push his way to Berlin in order to save Allied lives. He says, "Stalin is our ally. We have no reason to fear him or to think he will do anything improper, because we trust him." This situation really does not align with military logic, especially when estimates suggest that it would take 100,000 troops to capture the city. This causes great concern, especially among the British, as Churchill and others are determined to reach Berlin. However, for Stalin, 1,000,000 men is just a statistic, as he often says. In the Red Army, human life is not valued for its own sake, but for what can be achieved through it. Even when informed that Berlin is within reach, Stalin chooses not to take risks. He sends one of Konev's units to make sure the Allies keep their word. Stalin lives in a world steeped in distrust, where any statement from Eisenhower about not wanting to take Berlin or advance eastward is met with total suspicion. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, Soviet artillery abruptly halted the festivities by bombarding the northeastern suburbs of Berlin. Zhukov and Konev rushed to the edges of the city. Many Nazi leaders, however, were trying to flee the city. Soldiers on the ground did not have that privilege, and those who tried to escape or showed signs of cowardice were summarily hanged throughout the city, with messages such as, "I was a coward," or "I was a deserter," hanging from their chests. The following morning, Soviet artillery unleashed a frenzied bombardment on central Berlin, while the remnants of General Helmut Weidling's 56th Tank Corps of the 9th German Army made a desperate retreat from Berlin, relentlessly attacked by Soviet aircraft. Other remnants of the German defense tried in vain to stop Zhukov's armies from advancing through the city, but their weakened units could only delay the enemy. That night, Zhukov and Konev reached the city's outskirts. Hitler remained confident that a massive counterattack by the newly created Steiner Task Force and the 9th Army against Zhukov's flanks would trap the invaders in the city, similar to what happened in Stalingrad 2 years earlier. When it became clear the next day that Steiner's task force lacked the strength and ammunition to attack, Hitler finally snapped and admitted for the first time that everything was hopelessly lost. With the Soviets breaking into the city, General Weidling was appointed commander of Berlin's defense area. However, when Weidling took command, there were only about 45,000 Wehrmacht and SS soldiers, just over 40,000 Volkssturm members, and a meager 60 fuel-starved tanks to defend the city against roughly 1.5 million Soviet troops. Inevitably, Zhukov's armies managed to drive the defenders from the eastern and southeastern suburbs by the 23rd, while other flanks tightened the noose around the city. With imminent defeat in sight, many defenders began to lay down their arms. However, some continued to resist fanatically. At Tempelhof Airport, a mixed group of German defenders led by the SS, including about 100 members of the Hitler Youth, wreaked havoc on attacking Soviet tanks and infantry. It took a massive air and artillery bombardment to finally capture the airport. At that point, the siege of Berlin was complete. Hitler, delusional, promised Weidling that another massive counterattack by General Wenck's 12th Army in the southwest would come to the aid of the besieged defenders. However, Wenck had no intention of embarking on a futile suicide mission and instead moved to relieve the German troops encircled further east. On April 25, 1945, the Russians met the Western Allies for the first time. While Stalin played his suspicious games, the soldiers believed it was nothing more than a triumphant meeting of friends, and it became known as Elba Day. And of course, there were great celebrations, propaganda photos, much drinking, and much dancing. With the Western Front pacified at the Elbe, Berlin's fate in the hands of the Red Army was sealed. For the cultural elite, it meant saying goodbye to their city's illustrious history. As the Russians approached the city gates, Berlin was but a shadow of what it once was. One of the few buildings still partially standing was the Philharmonic Hall. So the crazy idea emerged to hold one final concert, a sort of farewell to culture in the city. The Philharmonic began to play on April 12th, with cyanide tablets being distributed to all members of the audience. Hitler appointed SS Brigade Führer Wilhelm Mohnke as battle commander for the Central Government District, which included the Reich Chancellery and the Führerbunker. He had more than 2,000 men under his command. Weidling organized the defenses into 8 sectors designated A through H, each commanded by a colonel or a general, but most had no combat experience. The Volkssturm was a national militia established by Nazi Germany in the last months of the Second World War. It was composed of men recruited between the ages of 16 and 60 who were not already serving in a military unit. The Volkssturm had a force of about 60,000 in the Berlin area, made up of 92 battalions, of which about 30 battalions of Volkssturm the Foreign. Those with some weapons were sent to forward positions, while those of Volkssturm II, those without weapons, remained in the city center. One of the few substantial combat units remaining to defend Berlin was the LVI Panzer Corps, which held the southeastern sector of the city, while the remaining parts were defended by what was left of the SS, the Volkssturm, and formations of the Hitler Youth. Meanwhile, Hitler denounced every perceived betrayal to the inhabitants of the Führerbunker. Not eager to die a death they considered pointless, many older Volkssturm members looked for places to hide from the advancing Soviet army. In contrast to the tragic image of Berlin resisting against all odds, there was the frequent exodus and surrender of Wehrmacht soldiers and Volkssturm members in southern and western Germany. A notable and unusual Volkssturm unit in the Battle for Berlin was the 3rd Siemensstadt Battalion. It was composed of 770 men, mostly veterans of the First World War in their 50s, who were reasonably fit factory workers with experienced officers. Unlike most Volkssturm units, it was fairly well equipped and trained. The battalion confronted Soviet troops on the 21st of April and saw the fiercest fighting over the next 2 days. It held out until the 2nd of May, when it had only 50 rifles and 2 light machine guns. The survivors fell back to join other Volkssturm units. 26 men from the battalion were awarded the Iron Cross. Allied bombing and Soviet artillery reduced Berlin to rubble, while the last resistance in Berlin dwindled to fight highly trained, battle-hardened Soviet troops. Red Army soldiers called the Hitler Youth formations, and the Volkssturm members who still fought to the end in Berlin, totalers, for being part of Germany's total mobilization effort. With no hope of relief, Weidling urged Hitler to attempt a breakout to the west to join the remnants of Army Group Vistula. Hitler, however, rejected the plan and reaffirmed his intention to fall in front of his troops. Over the next 3 days, the Red Army tightened the siege around Berlin, while the advanced armies approached the inner defensive line protecting the government district. The lack of clear demarcation lines between fronts led to various formations competing for space and getting confused in the resulting mud. After careful deliberation, it was decided that most of Konev's frustrated men would be redeployed to Czechoslovakia, while Zhukov would advance for the final blow. By the end of 29th April, the 8th Guards Army had broken through the heavily defended Tiergarten area, while the 3rd Shock Army crossed the Spree via the Moltke Bridge to the north. Before them lay the final prize, the blackened walls of the Reichstag, the former parliamentary building widely regarded as the symbolic heart of the Third Reich. Capturing it would be the culmination of the entire Soviet war effort. Hitler was in the bunker, leading in his final days, but he realized everything was collapsing around him. The sound of Russian explosions echoed above him, indicating the Russians were closing in rapidly. As Berlin was being destroyed, Hitler made one last public appearance, filming himself with the city's desperate defenders. He was seen outside the Führerbunker, where he interacted with children, praised them, and gave them medals. Despite advice from his inner circle to flee, Hitler was determined to face the Russian invasion. For him, it was the fate of both himself and the country. Nazi ideology, founded on supposed German racial superiority, fueled his conviction that Germans had the right to eliminate other peoples. The decline of the Germans was interpreted as a reflection of the failure of the German people. As a consequence of this failure, punitive measures were taken, such as the implementation of the Nero Decree, which included the destruction of bridges and communications links, leaving ordinary Berliners to fend for themselves. As the German capital prepared for a final reckoning, the war continued to bring more pain and suffering. With most men fighting or dead, the women of Berlin were in continual danger from invading soldiers. Looting soldiers kicked down their doors. If they needed to go out, they tried to make themselves as repulsive as possible by smearing their faces. The Russians' arrival in the city was accompanied by indifference to the civilian population's lack of water and hunger, as if they deserved that fate. We received calls from friends informing us that the Russians were already present. They advised us to get rid of all the alcohol, to throw it down the toilets because the Russians were out of control. Concern for the survival of the German people after the war was raised in the face of the impending destruction. Hitler replied that the question was not about survival. If the Germans were too weak to win, then they should perish. With Berlin's defenders surrendered, Zhukov's and Konev's armies had a clear path to advance toward the city center. The battle for Berlin was a scene of horror, where violence was intense and indiscriminate. Both fighters and civilians were victims of crossfire, ambushes, and snipers in a terrifying environment. The presence of about 1 million civilians, trapped in ventilation ducts and basements, added a nightmarish element to an already dreadful situation. A large number of people, thousands of them, chose to take their own lives. Entire families, ordinary citizens. One reason was fervent conviction. Another was the desire to protect their daughters and wives from sexual violence. When some Soviets had access to alcohol, they attacked indiscriminately. It is estimated that about 100,000 women were victims of rape in Berlin, and 2 million across Germany. The Red Army proved extremely brutal. Driven by a strong desire for revenge, they did not hesitate to loot or set fires. I cannot say beyond doubt that no one did anything wrong, especially in the rear, but I must say that our commander, General Zhukov, was not the type to let his troops run wild. Our orders were very strict, and we were closely supervised by political and counterintelligence officers. If anyone was caught, they were severely punished. There may have been isolated cases in the battalion, but on my patrol I never witnessed any of that. Street after street, house after house, Soviet troops advanced toward the city's historic center. On the front line of the German defense were youths recruited by Hitler, now mere pawns on the front line. They were children, not truly understanding what they were doing. sent in front of the elite troops who had marched from Moscow to Berlin. While the Russians plunder Berlin, 15 meters below the city, Hitler compares himself to his hero, Frederick the Great of Prussia. He waits in vain for his armies to save the Reich from the barbarians. Deep underground, he has accepted that the end is near. Hitler and Eva Braun get married while Hitler is at his peak. He normally dismisses marriage. His bride, he claims, is Germany. But Eva Braun, the Bavarian photographer's assistant, remains by his side even knowing the danger. She chooses to come to the bunker and refuses to leave. After years of living in the shadows as his mistress, she finally gets what she always wanted: recognition. Shortly after, Hitler dictates his will. He blames the Jews for the war and for Germany's defeat, and urges the German people to uphold the principles of National Socialism, especially its racial laws. He assures his people that their 6-year struggle will one day be recognized as the most glorious and valiant manifestation of a nation's will to exist. He appoints Grand Admiral Dönitz to succeed him as leader of Germany and continue the fight. Not even Adolf Hitler's death will end the war. Hitler understood that a commander-in-chief does not flee to Argentina in a submarine, so there was no other alternative. His final plan was simple. With cyanide and a pistol shot, Adolf Hitler left the world he had been so eager to conquer, one in which he had caused unnecessary suffering and death. The last hope for German victory had died long before. But Adolf Hitler undoubtedly imagined it had died with him. Hitler did not want to be captured by the Soviet Union and have his body humiliated like Mussolini's. For that reason, he ordered that he be cremated. With their furious hordes, followers decided they could not live in a world without National Socialism. Ardent Nazis, from Goebbels to even the mayor of Leipzig, took their own lives and, in many cases, those of their families. While Hitler's charred body lay half destroyed, barely a kilometer away, the Russian armies held the heart of the Reich in their hands. After weeks of racing, the two generals finally approached the Imperial Parliament building. With only seconds separating them at the final stretch, General Konev neared the lead, only to be suddenly stopped in his tracks by his rival, Marshal Zhukov, who was nearby. Zhukov was carrying Stalin's orders to take the Reichstag. After months of brutal fighting and sacrificing tens of thousands of his men's lives, Konev realized he would never claim the trophy, and had been nothing but a pawn to raise the stakes. Konev could do nothing against Zhukov, because Zhukov had been appointed by Stalin. He was Stalin's man in the army. Stalin was a master at creating enigmas, spreading illusion everywhere. As the city of Berlin surrendered to the Red Army, Zhukov had to ensure that Stalin got the photograph he had been waiting for. The Reichstag had not been in use since it was set on fire in February 1933, and its interior looked more like a pile of rubble than a government building. The German troops inside made excellent use of that and were heavily entrenched. The defense of the building and its surroundings was led by a determined group of SS fighters, mostly foreigners, with little to lose. The next morning, Soviet artillery opened fire while several hundred assault troops advanced. After intense gunfire, the men reached the main entrance and began clearing the building in brutal close-quarters combat. Fierce fighting followed, room by room. At that point, there was still a large contingent of German soldiers in the basement who launched counterattacks against the Red Army. On May 2, 1945, the Red Army had full control of the building. The famous photo of two soldiers raising the flag on the roof was a reenacted photograph taken the day after the building was seized. For the Soviets, the event depicted in the photo became a symbol of their victory. Thus, a red flag sewn by a Jew over the Reichstag and photographed by a Jewish photographer. However, Hitler's death and the conquest of the Reichstag did not immediately bring an end to the fighting. The new chancellor, Joseph Goebbels, rejected Stalin's demand for the unconditional surrender of the garrison, leading the Red Army to bombard the remaining German positions until the defense was reduced to a few isolated pockets. With Goebbels's subsequent suicide announced that night, the door to peace in Berlin finally opened. At 6 a.m. on May 2nd, General Weidling officially ordered his remaining men to lay down their arms. When the guns finally fell silent the following afternoon, an eerie silence descended upon the city, of which Zhukov would later write, "The flame of the World War was extinguished where it had first ignited." Although fighting in Europe continued until Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8th, the war had reached its climax in the Battle of Berlin. As the photograph of the flag atop the Reichstag reached international front pages, the world celebrated the long-awaited end of the war with Nazi Germany. Marshal Zhukov was rushed back to take a place of honor in Moscow's parade, where he was hailed as the greatest war hero of his country. The German plan to win in the final years of World War II depended entirely on what was happening at the moment. Hitler and the High Command spent the end of the war in a reactive state, constantly changing strategic priorities to secure the completion of short-term objectives, most of which never materialized. Whether driving toward the Caucasus oil fields in 1942 or raising millions of old men and boys to fight battle-hardened Allied soldiers in 1944. Hitler was not a military strategist, but a vain tyrant with exceptional oratory skills who sought to impose his vision on the world. And when the world did not accept his vision, he sought to punish it, beginning with his own people. Germany resisted far longer than many would have suspected, partly due to ideological fervor, but mainly out of fear, whether of Allied justice or Soviet or Nazi reprisals. Even with this intoxicating mixture of fear and zeal in the air, Hitler began to believe that the German people were not only weak, but had betrayed their Führer, costing them their chance at racial domination. His paranoia reached its peak in March 1945, 2 months before the final surrender, when Albert Speer presented Hitler with a report stating that the economy could withstand only 1 more month. Perhaps surprisingly, Speer's reports ended with a humanitarian appeal, urging Hitler to consider the safety and survival of the German people, and to make provisions for them in the post-war world. Hitler's supposed response displayed the ruthlessness he believed his subjects lacked. He exclaimed, "If the war is lost, the people will also be lost. It is not necessary to worry about what the German people will need for their elemental survival. On the contrary, it is better for us to destroy even those things." Just pay attention to this part. A historian from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow stated in a BBC radio program that the soldiers of the Red Army were stunned upon arriving in Germany. For the first time in their lives, 8 million Soviet people went abroad. The Soviet Union was a closed country. All they knew about foreign countries was that there was unemployment, hunger, and exploitation. And when they arrived in Europe, they saw something very different from Stalinist Russia, especially in Germany. They were truly furious. They couldn't understand why, being so rich, the Germans had come to Russia. Declassified Russian archival data indicate 81,116 Soviet deaths in the operation. Another 280,251 were reported as wounded or ill. The operation also resulted in the loss of approximately 1,997 tanks and self-propelled armored vehicles. All losses were considered irreparable, meaning beyond any possibility of economic repair or no longer usable. The Soviets claimed to have captured nearly 480,000 German soldiers, and it is estimated that around 125,000 civilians died during the entire operation in the capital. In the areas captured by the Red Army, and before the fighting in the city center ended, Soviet authorities took measures to begin restoring essential services. Nearly all transportation into and out of the city had been rendered inoperative, and destroyed sewers had contaminated the city's water supplies. Soviet authorities appointed local Germans to lead each city block and organized cleanup operations. The Red Army made a great effort to feed the city's residents. Most Germans, both soldiers and civilians, were grateful to receive food distributed in the Red Army's public kitchens. After the capitulation, the Soviets went door to door, arresting and imprisoning anyone in uniform, including firefighters and railway workers. Other authors question the narrative of sexual violence by Red Army soldiers as being anything more than the sad normality found on all sides during the war, including among the Western Allies. Nikolai Berzarin, commander of the Red Army in Berlin, quickly introduced penalties, including the death penalty, for looting and rape. Despite Soviet efforts to provide food and rebuild the city, hunger remained a problem. In June 1945, a month after the surrender, the average Berliner was receiving only 64% of the daily ration of 1,240 calories. Across the city, more than 1 million people were homeless. For Stalin, the work was only beginning as the world celebrated. He ordered his troops in Berlin to begin hunting for the spoils of war. He initiated a large-scale reparations project before the Western Allies arrived, dismantling factories, libraries, and works of art. He sent his special teams to try to recruit scientists to take back to the Soviet Union. And, of course, he set his sights on the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute because of the nuclear materials stored there. But when his spies arrived at the laboratory, aside from a batch of uranium and a few research papers, they discovered that Hitler's atomic project had not advanced beyond its earliest tests. But Stalin still believed there was something there. He knew that this weapon would one day be the weapon of the future, and it was only after the Battle of Berlin that he realized the Americans were actually far ahead in nuclear weapons development, as proven by the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima. Stalin understood that it was more a show of force against the Soviet Union than against the Japanese. Stalin's paranoia was growing. The first to feel his wrath were some of his closest collaborators. He adopted a blood and iron mentality, reimposing Soviet power through death, purges, terror, and imprisonment, all to strengthen his personal rule. One of the measures he took was to immediately demote his generals. Thus, he reduced Zhukov's role after the war, sending him to Odessa, a post of lesser military importance. Now, the world was dividing in two, between the Western Allies, led by the Americans, who became the first superpower, and the Soviet Union, which very quickly became a nuclear power and the second superpower. And Germany was split in half. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.